entitled Lessons Learned in Green Infrastructure. This webcast is sponsored by EPA's Office of Wastewater Management. My name is Caitlin Amron with EPA's Green Infrastructure Program, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Thank you for joining us. Before we get to our presentations, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. First, we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. To ask a question, simply type your question in the questions box on your control panel and click the send button. If your control panel is not showing, click on the small orange box with the white arrow to expand it. You don't need to wait until the question and answer period to submit your question. We will try to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the webcast. However, due to the high number of participants, not all questions will be answered. Feel free to contact the speakers after this webcast. Speaker contact information will be available at the end of the presentation. If you have technical issues such as audio problems, please call the GoToWebinar support number listed on the screen here and give the assistant our conference ID number, also listed on the screen here. Today's presentation will be available on EPA's Green Infrastructure website, epa.gov/green infrastructure, within a few weeks. Lastly, we'd like to remind you that the views and materials presented by our speakers today are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the EPA. In today's webcast, speakers from EPA's Office of Research and Development in Casey Water in Kansas City, Missouri, will highlight lessons learned from green infrastructure practices. Experience with on-the-ground implementation provides a broad base for learning. This webinar will provide helpful green infrastructure lessons learned for communities, states, and other practitioners across the nation. With that, I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Michael Borst. Michael Borst is an engineer with EPA's Office of Research and Development, conducting green infrastructure research on performance and effectiveness.
Part of the EPA's overall research plan, we are teaming with the Camden County Municipal Utility Authority to monitor green infrastructure control measures within the city of Camden. Within Camden, we are looking at several types of SCMs, but today we're only going to talk about cisterns. The sites themselves are spread across the city. There's a highly urbanized community in the southwestern part of the New Jersey. It is served by a combined sewer system, and the eventual goal here is to reduce the amount of CSO entering the Delaware River. Cooper Sprouts is one of the gardens that we are monitoring. It has raised bed gardens. The gardens themselves are planted with vegetables for sustenance farming. The raised beds are over concrete pads, and you can see the exterior walls in the background. Most of them are set up to be sustenance gardens. This is the Cooper Sprouts Community Garden. You can see the kinds of things that they're growing. The crop in the front is Swiss chard. Behind it you have beets, cabbage, broccoli. So these are very much table foods that people are going to harvest and use. Keynes Avenue Community Center is a community kitchen. They feed up to 300 people a day, and they supplement donations with what they grow themselves. And again, this is very much a vegetable-oriented crop. You can see the corn and the squash in the right-hand picture, and you can see the vegetables and the raised beds on the back. At this site, it's a combination of raised bed and in-the-ground planting. St. Joan of Arc Church has their own community garden. It's located directly behind the church and is reserved for use by parishioners. The Vietnamese garden, community garden, is the largest of the community gardens that we are monitoring. It's about a half an acre. It raises a mixture of Asian and Western vegetables. Again, these are very much used as table food by the people surrounding the garden. The only place where we do not believe that this is food raised for the table is at a daycare center, where it seems to be more an educational value. The kids go out and watch the crops grow during the season. So this is less of a food production than a teaching tool. In Canton, we have two basic research questions that we want to get to. One is, does the design of what has been installed meet the demand? Does the cistern capture the water that is needed for the gardeners? And then how much water is actually used by the gardeners? Because those things have to be in balance for a good design. And then we want to look separately at the water quality questions. And we picked a handful of environmental stressors that we want to keep track of. Mostly, we are monitoring with only two tools here. One's a traditional pressure transducer level logger. We picked Solnist in part because that's what we had in stock. And then we have time of tipping bucket rain gauges that we got from Onset. These are the traditional hobo ones that a lot of folks are using. The cisterns themselves get water from two kinds of sources. One, they were installed next to an existing structure where we can capture the rainwater from the rooftops through the existing gutter and downspout. And that's true at St. Joan of Arc, Kings Avenue, and Respond. The second type is that the Camden County Municipal Utility Authority built shade structures in the garden area to serve as a source of rainwater collection. This is what happened at the Vietnamese rain garden and at the Cooper Sprouts rain gardens. Looking a little bit about capture, this is what the shade structures look like. The structures themselves are 9 by 12. The pitch between the two vertical poles drops about 23 inches. When the water lands on the fiberglass roof, it runs down to the gutter, and the gutter then routes the collected water to an improvised downspout. This is not your traditional square household downspout. This is 6-inch PVC pipe that routes water to the cistern that you can see in the lower right-hand corner of the picture. You can also see where we installed the rain gauge on top of the shade structure. The downspout is not just coming straight down. There is a diversion control at the bottom. The idea is that the first small amount of rain that hits the roof will run down, be captured in this vertical pipe. When that is filled, the water will then be diverted into the cistern. Between rain events, the small black nipple at the bottom of the pipe drips the water out so that it'll be empty again for the next rain event. Estimating the amount of water capture is reasonably straightforward. We know the length and the width. This will be the projected area, not the true dimensions. We also know how much rain we got. So the rain depth times the area tells us the available volume. Similarly, we can look at the cisterns themselves, look at the pre-water rain depth, look at the post-event, and we can use the change in volume to get the volume collected. All of the cisterns are black HDPE structures. They're right circular, so this is an easy thing to keep track of. It's a little bit less easy to do it with the rooftops, and the designers actually had to go in and do a site survey and a little bit of Google Earth studying to see how large the drainage area going to the cistern is. This is St. Joan of Arc Church. The cistern is where the white triangle is, and this is what we estimate to be the drainage area going to that cistern. Obviously, we have much less confidence in this than we do in the constructed shade structure where the carpenter was out there with the ruler and making it to size. Looking a little bit at the data, in all of these graphs, water level will be shown in green and be on the left-hand axis, and rainfall will be in red going to the right-hand axis. Now, we looked at the capture ratio as the ratio of the volume captured to the rainfall that we should have captured if perfect capture occurred. And Here's an example where we got 3.2 cubic meters of rainfall captured, but we think that 8.3 cubic meters of rainfall landed on this roof structure itself. So we're only getting about 39% of the rainfall in this particular event. We only did this for events where we could capture the entire rainfall volume in the cistern. If there was any overflow at all, we discarded the rain event. So the second rain event that took place in early October, we could not use because the tank overflowed and we don't have an estimate of the overflow volume. Looking at all of the cisterns together, the capture ratios are much smaller than we were expecting. We didn't expect to capture every drop that theoretically landed on the roof, but we expected to get more than this. We're not quite sure why these are this small. It might just be the small number of rain events that we managed to capture during the event, during the first season. We're doing this again, so we should be able to get better values of this as we go on. Again, we just don't know what's going on here. We did expect these to be higher. A little bit about water use. Once we capture it, we need for the people to use it for it to be of practical use as a stormwater control. And here again, we're looking at the water levels, the change in level between rain events. So we had a rain event where the L1 shows the initial water level was 1.04 meters. Before the second rain event, about August the 8th, the water level had dropped 0.12 meters. So essentially, we've only used 11% of the available water between rain events. Looking at this across the various sites, two of the cisterns, we had no water use at all. And this is at least partially due to construction delays eating their way into the growing season. At St. Joan of Arc Church, we didn't get construction done until the end of July. At Respond, it was in September when clearly the growing season was over. But the other three sites were all up and running in May. And here, the sites are using 8 to 34% of the available water during the course of the growing season. Looking at the patterns of the two sites with the most use, Keynes Avenue and the Vietnamese Garden, we see two entirely different use patterns. At Keynes Avenue, they tended to use it all at once or not at all. There are a couple events in there where they use small amounts of water, but generally, most of the water was consumed in the two very large use events. At the Vietnamese Garden, on the other hand, water was used pretty routinely, that we see lots of small drops over the course of the growing season. And we ended up using 34% of the total rainfall captured during that period. The other thing that the two sites with the most use had in common was that there was a pump connected. The community gardens themselves installed the pump. This was not part of what was installed for them. And these seem to be really important in the overall use of things. We also looked at whether or not this was just a case where it rained a lot and they didn't need to use the water just because it was raining regularly. Overall, it was a drier than average year, and the ET estimates are that we are well below the required water demand for the plants. Looking at the Vietnamese garden up close, event by event, shows some kind of interesting patterns that developed. That when the gardeners chose to water from the cistern, they used it twice a day. That they use it in the morning and then they use it again in the afternoon. Whether this is the same gardener going in, coming back out, or two different gardeners choosing to do it at different times, we don't really know. But clearly there are two uses, and this occurs repeatedly over the course of the monitoring. The next surprise was that if you look at the vertical black arrow, we see a rather significant 1.2 meter rise in the water depth, but it didn't rain. We were assuming that the gardener went out, saw there was no water in the cistern, was using his hose connected to the house, and as long as I'm here, I might as well go ahead and fill the cistern, kind of thinking. But overall, 60% of the water came from non-rain events. Looking at a little bit about water quality, here's our strategy. Our plan on the way in was to collect samples in April, June, July, September, and November, and like all good plans, it died immediately. The construction was not done until May, as we just talked about, so the April event did not occur last year, but we did substitute an October event for last year. So far this year, we are generally on schedule to do this, so be able to look at year-over-year comparisons. And here's what we see. Microorganisms were a stressor of concern, and the concentrations are just all over the place. It was, to me, very surprising, not just how often they were detected, but the range of values that we have. All of these are geometric means. They're done by IDEX, most probable number analysis by region 2. And some of the values that we got individually were over 250,000 for total coliform. So that was a surprise. All of these are obviously well above the zero that you want for drinking water. And one of the sites is actually over the FDA standard for irrigating covered produce. That's at 126 as the most probable number. With the values being so noisy, we cannot detect a statistically significant difference across the sites. We're also looking at metals. The first bullet is kind of important, that looking at antimony, arsenic, cadmium, and chromium, we never detected it above the ICP-MS detection limit. These are relatively small values. The other thing that becomes readily apparent is that the shade structures with the fiberglass roofing material are consistently lower than the roof structure that used the existing materials that were there, both the roofing material, the gutters, and the downspouts. The shade structure does have zinc. This is probably galvanized metal used in attaching the fiberglass to the wooden frame. And then here are the detection frequencies for them. If you look at vanadium, we got it very rarely, so this is not, running all over the place, but the others were getting them rather consistently. We sent samples to Cincinnati for nutrient analysis, and we looked at ammonia, nitrite, phosphate, total nitrogen, and total organic carbon. These were detected in every sample that we submitted, and this is how things averaged out. These are not dangerously high values. As long as you're less than 5,000 micrograms per liter, you don't really have a problem. It's important to note that the water does not meet drinking water standards. The cisterns are all labeled in English and Spanish. Basically, don't drink the water. It's the best you can do. We have seen people playing in the water, however, so that's something to be concerned about. Things that we've learned so far. Water use is below what we expected. These are well cared for gardens. The people take it very seriously. It's table food, sustenance, and consumption is relatively low. The anecdotal version that we got from a couple people was, without a pump in place to use the water in the cistern, it is simply impractical to use the water to water the crops. There's just not enough head to transfer the water quickly, and there's definitely not enough to operate a sprinkler, which some of the gardeners wanted as the way to do things. The other thing that we heard is it's just easier to use the spigot. The hose is already connected. I don't have to do anything. So this too is a concern. We've been talking with CCMUA in Region 2, and one of the things that we think might actually be useful here is some sort of educational outreach program to explain exactly what's happening and what the water is. The capture ratio is significantly smaller than expected. We just don't really have a good idea why. Perhaps the diversion valve is not working as well as we hope it is. But basically, this is saying that we are only getting about half of the rain that theoretically landed on the rooftops. This is very surprising for the structures where we know precisely how big the rooftop is. Metal concentrations were all below the EPA long-term irrigation standards. These are the more conservative standards that the agency puts forth. Nutrient concentrations are well below the FAO irrigation standards. And at one site and only one site were the E. coli concentrations above the FDA irrigation standards. Going forward, we're going to sample and monitor the sites for 2 more years. We were originally planning on just 1, but now we have found the funds to go ahead and do the 2nd year. And there's some contact information if you want to get in touch with us. That's it. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you so much, Mike. Before we get to our next speaker, I'd like to run a couple of audience polls. So for our first poll, we would like to know how many of you that are together are viewing the webinar. So the options are going to be just you, 2 to 5 people, 6 to 10 people, 11 to 19 people, or more than 20. So we're tracking how many of you have responded, and we'll close the poll when the majority of people on the call have responded. Thank you very much. All right, we'll just wait a few more seconds. If there's any other people that can respond to our poll, we really appreciate you guys letting us know. That's how we keep these webinars going, is getting an accurate number of attendees. Okay, we'll go ahead and close this poll. Thank you everyone who answered. We have one more poll that we're going to run, and this will be our last poll of this webinar. We would like to know your primary field of employment, and the options are academic, government, a county employee, government federal employee, municipal government employee, state employee. And if you are a different option or none of the above, just send us that in the question box. Thank you. Okay, thank you everyone. We're going to go ahead and close the poll. And with that, I am pleased to announce our next speaker, Ms. Lisa Trees. Lisa Trees is a landscape architect with over 10 years of experience in practice. She's a staff member at KC Water since 2012. She's responsible for informing decisions related to green infrastructure and site design, monitoring green infrastructure maintenance agreements, and advising internal maintenance programs. Lisa holds a Bachelor's of Landscape Architecture and a secondary major in Natural Resources and Environmental Science from Kansas State University, and is a licensed landscape architect in the state of Missouri.
Hello, everyone. I think the PowerPoint's about to come up. So I'm going to be presenting about tips for good green infrastructure outcomes. So we have had our project, one of our largest projects in place for about 3.5 years, and so I'll talk about things that we've learned through that project. So Kansas City, Missouri is a river city. We are situated on the Missouri River, and this picture shows a view to our downtown from the Missouri River. So most of our water drains here eventually. In Kansas City Water Services, or KC Water, we provide drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater services to our ratepayer area. So what we're here to talk about today is improving water quality and what we've learned by doing that. So pushing the pollution to the river is not the solution anymore, at least you know, in the United States. We try not to do this anymore. I think the Olympics going on in Rio right now is a very kind of timely reminder of why all of these things that we do under the Clean Water Act are important, and why it really benefits all of our health and well-being. So our project area before our pilot project, which was our first big project that we built, it was a unincorporated area that was brought into the city kind of on a later scale, I believe in the 50s or 60s. So it was built under rural development standards for the most part. And the residents were not happy with the condition of their sidewalks and roads. So when we came in with our project, among many other things, we addressed water quality, and were able to find some additional funding to improve the sidewalks and roads. So this particular project was located only in the street rights-of-way, which really limited our options. We were pretty hemmed in. And it's primarily a residential area with one street, basically, of commercial frontage. And we tried a variety of technologies. This graphic shows the different approaches used, the different techniques. And then in some of the locations, we have some underground storage pipes that basically act as underground detention, and they dewater within about 40 hours. The results of our project that we have to date, we are essentially detaining over 360,000 gallons within our pilot project area. And we were able to bring those triple bottom line benefits that you hear about. We brought a variety of different benefits to this neighborhood, including sewer rehab as part of the project, and traffic calming through curb extensions where we had kind of bump outs along the street. We replaced a number of street trees. I think it was around 136 street trees were added. And then we were able to replace the majority of sidewalks, so not all. Some were in pretty good shape, so we didn't impact those. And we've been seeing some pretty good results in our flow monitoring, which is shown in the diagram with the pipes up here in the upper right. And we expect, you know, so this is the start of what we're building in the Middle Blue River Basin watershed. It's 744-acre basin, and this was a 100-acre catchment area. And so we're currently under construction on the remainder of the basin. So then we'll see what our ultimate results are for the whole basin, and that's how we'll hopefully, and we're on track to meet our consent decree target for our overflow control program. So for the remainder of the basin, we're taking a little bit of a modified approach based on some of the things we've learned, which I'll go into in detail some more. We have the luxury of having some larger parcels available in the remainder of the basin, so we're using those. And so, for example, there is one existing park that was already in the valley, so we're working with our Parks Department and we're putting in a project there. there was a large vacant parcel that we were able to use, and then a few smaller city parcels that we're using for the project. We did have a few locations where right-of-way space is going to be used because there weren't any larger parcels nearby. So kind of, I guess, our preference that's developing as we've been working on these projects is if we can fit it on a larger parcel that we own preferably, then we have control over it. It's a little bit easier for us to take care of. If it's in the right-of-way, you know, we're impacting a lot more people directly, and so there's just that much more outreach and education that goes along with it. So we try to look at if we can use large parcels first, we're going to try to do that. We also think we can get some better cost effectiveness that way. But where we don't have that option, then the right-of-way is one of the options on the table. So I've broken this presentation up in two main segments. One will be just tips about design and beauty, and then the second section is tips for implementation. So I'll be going through this pretty fast, so I encourage you, follow up with me afterwards if you have more detailed questions. So the key is, beauty is subjective. Everyone has a different definition of beautiful. So we always get into this conversation with green infrastructure projects, oh, well, it just doesn't look good, or, we kind of have these different conversations. And, the challenge is, we're doing a bit of a paradigm shift, so we have to look at, okay, what can we do to appeal to the largest number of people, recognizing we're always going to have some folks who don't like the way it looks. So we just try to get as much balance as you can. So I look at it as balancing the wildness with artfulness. And based on the context, you can have a little bit more wildness, or you need to dial back that wildness if you're in different contexts. So you need to be paying very close attention to the context. So the first tip is clean edges. Clean edges can go a really long way to building acceptance. Messy edges tend to be turn off for a lot of people. They see the messy edge and they think, okay, no one's taking care of this. So avoid having the plants flop over into the walks or the roadways. Things like small stone walls, decorative rock, or even just a mowed sod strip in front of it can really help to make people feel more comfortable with the plants. Hardscapes. So hardscape is critical to be able to make it look intentional. So if you have a BMP that has a walkway and it's inviting, and you find a way to make it a space, then it's not just, oh, we've got that water quality thing over there in the corner that no one pays attention to. You bring it into your site and actually make it part of your site by including hardscape. These are some examples of different ways to do that. Sometimes a few nicely placed pieces of stone or landscape boulders, different things like that can really make it feel intentional. That's the key. So geometry. As in any landscape design or landscape architecture, the geometry is an important piece of it. So this is an example that I like to use where clearly geometry was really considered. And so instead of just kind of making a hole and putting some plants in it, they looked at, okay, we're creating a space, and we're going to add this decorative bench feature, and we're going to add some hardscape to make this look like we're doing it on purpose. So a lot of this is classic design theory, things that, if you're working with a landscape architect or an architect, it's kind of second nature to their design process. And if you don't have someone like that on your team and you're working on a project, then if you bring them in, you'll probably have a better outcome in terms of acceptance on your project. Too many times we see where there's this little hole off to the side, and that's considered the green infrastructure. Those usually aren't well received. If you can make it be actually part of your campus or a feature, that's where you can start seeing some of those real benefits of that feature, and you can actually give it a longer life because people like it. So art can really help to bridge that, acceptance factor, get people to like your project more if you have an art component. And this does, admittedly, this adds time and cost, but a lot of cities, may have some type of program where they're trying to integrate art into public improvement projects. So it might be a way to use some of that opportunity with your project. So this is an example that is at Sanitation District Number 1 in Northern Kentucky, and it was done by Human Nature landscape architects. And they used, you can see on this cistern, they have this fountain feature around the outside. And then down at the bottom, they have some different engravings, if you're up close to it, that you can see. They also integrated these 3 circles where one has pavement in it, one has turf, and one has deep-rooted native plants. And then at this project, they can turn on water so that it pours on the different locations, and the flumes show the time of concentration of the water. So the one with the pavement, the water starts to run off immediately, and the turf takes a little longer, and the deep-rooted plants take that much longer. So it's just a hands-on, very direct demonstration of what green infrastructure can do. Plant selection. So this is one where, there's so many opinions on this, but I guess the kind of moderate approach we've arrived at is including some traditional garden plants in strategic locations can kind of help ease people in to the green infrastructure features. So what we try to do is look at having about 75% native plants, especially in the hard-working part of the garden, so the part where you're trying to get your most infiltration and you need those deep roots, like the basin of it. So we try to look at having the native plants in the working or the hard-working part of the garden, and then around the edges, around 25% of traditional plants. So this is just kind of a, what I'd like to think of as a balanced approach. And, I found this example of the tulips in there, which, for some people, if that makes them feel comfortable with the water quality green infrastructure, then that's fine. It's not going to damage the functioning of that feature as long as it's, as long as that's kind of part of the original design thought. But classic landscape design principles are important. I think early on when we were doing these projects, we tended to kind of throw that out and just focus on, okay, we need to get plants that'll survive and have some, hardworking roots. And we kind of threw out some of our classic design theory, and then we had some BMPs or green infrastructure that wasn't as well received. So now it's trying to bring that back in, trying to really think about form, texture, color. Flowers go a long way with people. The grasses are easier and much easier to take care of, but if you can have some flowers in there, that does help to gain acceptance. So trees. This is something that we're trying to look at on a few of our upcoming projects. I saw a webinar that James Urban and Kestrel Design Group did not too long ago, where they were talking about the suspended pavement, where they use the silva cells underground and they bring the stormwater into there. So this could maybe fit in locations where you don't have space for using, surface features, or where you just are getting a lot of pushback on having a surface feature. So, trying to have as many tools in the toolbox as we can, this to me seems like it's a really promising one, and it sounds like some communities are using these very effectively. So I'm hoping we can start to try a few of these and see how it works for us. Water features, they come with more upkeep often, but this is something that if you're trying to gain that acceptance, the lower left image on this overflow for a pond, all it took was just adding a few additional ledge rocks to make it not just spilling right down a flat face. It actually, added some variety and some contrast, so you have some also additional sound of flowing water. So looking at ways to just kind of make it a little bit interesting instead of just utilitarian. And, depending on the facility, sometimes you can make a feature that recirculates, or maybe has a solar pump, so that you're using that water as a feature, and also getting lots of good evaporation to help use up that excess water that you might have in a stormwater situation. And this is just a really neat example. It's at, I think, the Oregon Convention Center, and forgive me if I'm saying that location wrong, on the left side. But the water comes down through this overhead kind of rain channel, and it flows through the landscape in a really beautiful and interesting way. So now I'll talk about implementation. So I'm going to be kind of blazing through these, so bear with me. But soliciting community feedback, I put this first because it's very important. Working with the existing neighborhood groups or stakeholders, and just remembering sometimes the loudest voices aren't representing the majority. So if you can give opportunities for people to also provide confidential input, whether it's comment cards, some way that they can share their thoughts with you without having to stand in front of 40 of their neighbors that maybe they're shy about talking in front of. Renderings and reality. So one of the things, kind of an early mistake maybe that we made, was showing renderings that maybe were not achievable, or maybe they were achievable in 5 years with good maintenance practices, but not what people would originally see. So one of the things we're trying to be very deliberate about now is showing images of newly planted green infrastructure so that people can see, okay, when it first goes in, this is very close to what it will look like. So we don't get any false impressions, and we avoid letting people down. Infrastructure costs. There may be some other infrastructure that has to be improved while you're doing the green infrastructure. For example, if you have damaged catch basins right by where you're doing your rain garden feature, at some point you're going to have to come back and fix that catch basin. So, it's worth it to try to figure out how to do it at the time of the project so that you're not coming back 5 years later and damaging your investment by, making a repair. This is especially true in the street right-of-way. So completing the picture. So if you were to visit our pilot project, we have 135 vegetated BMPs in the right-of-way, and we have about 3 where the sidewalks weren't in the area that were getting replaced, because in general the sidewalks on this block were very good, but there just happened to be basically 2 homes where, for whatever reason, the sidewalk wasn't there, and then their drive apron happened to be in this condition. So there are a few places where if we had just gone in and fixed those few small spots, we kind of drew a line and said if it's outside of our replacement area for the sidewalks, we're not doing it. But if we had gone in and just done a few locations, then we wouldn't have a potential, of course these homeowners were going, well, how come ours looks so different from Bob's down the street? Planning for maintenance. So this is critical. If you don't have the maintenance lined up, then it's time to think about, are you ready to do the project? I mean, I'm being blunt, but the maintenance on these is make or break the success of the project. So that has been one of the things that we feel like we're doing well. We had the maintenance lined up, and in our pilot project area, it's been costing us approximately $1 to $2 per square foot of actual green infrastructure footprint per year to maintain the project. and that's through the establishment phase. So we expect that those prices will start to go down because we are getting things more established and there's less mulching, for example, because the plants are growing together more. But clearly defining the expectations and responsibilities is really important. Staying communicative, one of the mistakes that we made during construction that we heard from our residents afterwards. We had a meeting with the residents after to say, what do we do well and what can we do better next time? And a lot of them said, you know, you guys did so much communicating with us during the design, but then when you started construction, it was kind of all we were hearing from were just a contractor here and there, and they didn't always maybe know the correct information, or maybe they didn't, you know, they just didn't have time to necessarily share it. So one of the things we really heard was keeping the communication consistent from the start of design through the end of construction. So I don't know if we can say this one enough either, because it's, especially if you're right in the right-of-way, you got to be very communicative with your residents and property owners. Erosion control. So one of the things we learned from our campus project that we've just finished, and on this project we were doing a good job of keeping the muddy water from leaving our site, so we were in compliance with our SWIP. But what we hadn't looked at as much as we wish we had, and as much as we wish we had built it into the contract and the requirements for the contractor, was to really prevent the water from getting muddy in the first place. So what I'm trying to say about this is, you know, in the case of our site, we had most of our inlets blocked off so that the muddy water wouldn't leave. But if we had had a lot more effort put on blankets, and we had quite a few wattles, but, you know, maybe more, and maybe using something like a temporary bypass pipe, which should show in the next slide. This is an example from Omaha, which I think it's about to pop up. We're getting there. Well, it'll be up soon. So what they did is, if you have a location where you have a concentrated flow coming into where your green infrastructure is going to be, if you can put a surface pipe that connects to where your concentrated flow is coming out and pipe that water around your construction site, it's clean water, you know, it's not muddy in terms of your SWIP requirements. So if you can use that temporary bypass pipe, bypass that water around your site so you're not constantly filling your site with water and having to wait for it to dry up enough where you can work it. Also, you know, we found that the erosion control, apart from maintenance, is probably one of the other most critical factors to make sure that your green infrastructure works. If you get a bunch of silt in there and then it rains, and then it rains, and then you're coming to do your planting, and you say, oh, we'll just muck that out, we'll just remove that silt. Well, what sometimes happens is maybe you don't get a break in the rain, and you've got people yelling that you need to finish the project, so you end up sacrificing your quality. And we ran into this on one of our projects where, you know, we're still trying to resolve a drainage issue because we basically had a lot of sediment that had gotten into that basin, and it was really hard to get it dried out. It just kept raining. So temporary bypass pipe, saw that in Omaha and was very impressed. It was a good idea. Curb markers, if you have a project where you might need curb markers, you know, basically bollards to delineate where your project is, what we learned is get the resident input or the property owner input. Give them maybe 3 options that you can actually do in terms of cost and be able to maintain, and then let them vote, and then whichever one gets the most vote, that's what you go with. So for our pilot project, the curb markers sort of ended up being an afterthought. They came in kind of late in the game, The residents hadn't seen them. We got, mixed reviews. Some people love them, some people don't. But on our future projects, we put 3 options for a vote, and we're going with the one that got the most votes. Infiltration rate. You can double check that infiltration rate before you install the plants and save you a lot of time. And if you're having an issue with infiltration and you're trying to get that resolved, use mosquito treatment in the meantime. So there's different types of briquettes you can put in there that will prevent mosquito larvae from being able to grow into adults while you're getting your issue resolved. Optimizing porous pavements. It's really important to have them away from chronic sediment sources. And if you're putting sidewalks in, make sure you have a buffer of a regular traditional concrete, maybe 1 panel next to that driveway so that you don't have issues with cracking. But pervious pavements are not a panacea. You need to put them where they make sense. They work very well in a parking lot that doesn't receive a lot of sediment. They don't work so great at the bottom of a hill that might have erosion. They plug up if you have them at the bottom of a hill and they're getting sediment on them. Utility conflicts. This is a really difficult one in the right-of-way, but the more that you can avoid overlapping those utilities, the better luck you're going to have. We had a few places where, especially the water shutoff valves, where we had some conflicts with those, and could have saved ourselves some damage if we had been able to work around those a little bit more. Theft and vandalism. Sometimes you wouldn't think that shrubs would get stolen, but sometimes it can happen. So just, determine before you have your project bidding, determine how you're going to handle theft and vandalism, who's going to be responsible. Curb extensions, we found that a 5-foot radius is a little bit small. And so you can see in this image there's a little bit of dirt that's still there in that radius. Our sweeper can make about a 10-foot radius, but it can't make a 5-foot. So what we learned, and our sweeper fleet, they're very large mechanical sweepers. So 10-foot, we really would do better with that. So that's kind of a rule of thumb, 10-foot. Pretreatment methods. I would recommend not using a concrete 4-bay sump. We really have had some challenges with these. We're going back in and retrofitting them. So the ones on the top of the image, we were having a lot of water that was ponding. They have holes in them, but they weren't draining. And it's basically like a little concrete bathtub that's supposed to help capture some of the sediment and litter. So we've gone back and we've been raising them up some with some ideas from Omaha, which has been much appreciated. We have been adding some layers to lift them up out of the bottom of the bed. We want to keep the pretreatment method at street level as much as possible. Ours were way down in the bottom, and that's where a lot of our problems came from. Sod filter strips. We've had pretty good luck with these, but just making sure you know who's going to mow those. We go ahead and mow the sod filter strips that we have, and that's just the strip between the curb and the rain garden, because our residents mow on a different schedule, and we like them to all kind of be mowed at the same time. But just make sure you check for erosion or creation of a false curb. Sometimes you might get some debris there, and it can kind of create a little lip that makes the water go around, so you have to watch for that. So edging is really important. We had a few places where the boundary wasn't quite clear enough, and so we had some overzealous mowing. Sometimes, mowing doesn't necessarily mean a death sentence, especially for perennials and grasses, depending on what time of year it happens. So in this case, they did grow back, and they actually grew back a little shorter, so it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. But just keeping in mind, traditional metal edging, where commercial landscapers are used to seeing that and using it, if you're in a residential area, it's not as much of a familiar material, and so it can be very easily overlooked, or it's pretty easy for grass to grow over it if it's not being consistently edged. So just keeping in mind robust edging can really help make that boundary clear so that people won't unintentionally mow into the rain garden, because they're not trying to cause a problem. They're just trying to take care of their property, and they may not know where the boundary is. Weeds can sometimes appear in pervious paver areas, and what we've found, the easiest thing, and I think I heard this from a gentleman from South Carolina in a presentation, was the weed torch. So we bought a weed torch. It's not very expensive. You just go out, torch the weeds, and there you go. Trimming frequency, especially if you're in a place that gets a lot of rainfall, and if you have concerns about plants getting too tall, you can do an extra trim. In the Kansas City area, as long as that extra trim is done, roughly before the end of June, you can still get a lot of the benefits in the seed heads and the flowers. It's just the plants are a little shorter. So it's kind of a trick, depending on what part of the country you're in, that schedule is going to be different. But when we have really rainy years, our plants tend to get a little bigger. So sometimes if it's a really dry year, you may not need to do extra trimming. Intersection sight lines are really critical, and the rule of thumb we're using is 40-foot intersection sight triangle and keeping things lower than 18 inches from the top of curb. And in general, we've found when we do various tours and bring people through, the rain gardens in the right-of-way that people like the best, or we get the most, I guess, positive comments, are the ones where we were able to make them a little wider and a little shallower, and they have the sod mow strip in the front. So that's kind of, wherever we have the space to do it this way, we've had better comments and, seems to have better acceptance. So that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Very interesting presentations from both of you. We're now going to open it up to our question and answer session. We've been calling the questions throughout the presentations, and so we're verbally going to ask first Mike and then Lisa a question, and we'll alternate between a question for each of you before the end of up until about 2:25 or so. And then when we run out of time, we'll stop asking questions. So I'm also putting up a slide that has the presenter's contact information and my contact information and our green infrastructure website. So our first question is for Mike. Is the purpose of the vertical downspout section to capture the first flush, i.e. potential buildup on the roof?
That's the thinking, yes, and we don't really know how well it works, but the idea is that we will divert that first small volume, capture it in the vertical below the cutoff to the cistern, and then after the rain event, it'll drip slowly out so that we can reestablish volume for the next one. But yes, first flush.
Thank you, Mike. Lisa, you had mentioned that the maintenance costs were $1 to $2 per square foot for the pilot project, but do you have an average cost per impervious acre treated for the multiple projects you shared, particularly considering the additional design elements?
Well, we do have some numbers broken down that way. I could share them. I didn't have them included in this presentation because we're still trying to finalize some of that. So maybe the best would be if anyone wants those particular numbers to send me a follow-up email, and then I can make sure I get you the right numbers. If I try to guess, I'll say I'm wrong.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa. Mike, in Camden, why do you think E. coli was found in the water cistern?
Yeah, that's a really popular question. We're thinking that we get rodents up there of some variety, whether they be mice or chipmunks or squirrels or what have you, and we're thinking that's the source. We are starting to run qPCR to try to identify the source of the E. coli and the coliform in general, but those results aren't back yet.
Very interesting. Thank you, Mike. Lisa, how many partners have you typically worked with in the projects that you shared?
Well, in the pilot project, we, for the most part, so this was a consent decree project for our combined sewer overflow reduction requirements. So the city is the one in the consent decree. So we worked with, in the pilot, interdepartmentally with other city departments, our Public Works Department, for some of the street improvements, and to a limited extent, planning and some of our city council members. In terms of community partners, there was some research done. So there was actually an EPA ORD research project that went on during the early stage of this project, where they monitored, I believe it was 10 locations, and they partnered with our local university, UMKC, University of Missouri Kansas City, and they also worked with Tetra Tech, an engineering firm. So those have generally been the partners. We're looking to potentially have some maintenance partners, potentially a proposal for nonprofit groups to provide portions of the maintenance for a contract amount. So we're looking into some options. But probably, I would say in the pilot project, our biggest partner was the neighborhood organization, which is the Marlboro Coalition. It's a coalition of like 6 different neighborhood groups, and they were kind of the main reason that the project went forward in their neighborhood, because they really were interested in trying some new things, getting some investment in their area. And it so happened that the Middle Blue River Basin, the way that it lays out topographically, would have been the site, if we hadn't done green infrastructure in this basin, we would have had to do 1, or it could have been 2 above ground tanks, some large tanks that would be at the bottom of the watershed. And there is, because that's a more expensive way of managing our overflows than some of the underground methods, I guess, the cost benefit came out pretty even between doing green infrastructure and doing the traditional tank storage. So that's the other reason that this basin was selected. I don't know if I answered your question, but hopefully.
Yeah, no, you definitely did. That was excellent. Thank you, Lisa. Mike, are any future monitoring or monitoring sites going to include on-site treatment to remove pollutants?
ORD always finds itself in the kind of awkward position that we want to monitor performance, but we don't want to dictate what people do. If the community decides to install that, we would certainly be open to monitoring it. But all of these designs were actually specified by the municipal utility authority themselves, and all we did was come in afterwards and monitor what they had designed.
Thank you, Mike. Lisa, how would you recommend engaging different groups within communities, such as elders, youth, schools, and others, in order to enhance community identity?
Well, that's always the million-dollar question. We have used a number of different techniques in the pilot project area. So we have some specialists that do public involvement. I am not one of them. But they had, one example, they had a pancake breakfast, like a block party in the neighborhood, and they worked with the neighborhood group to advertise that. And so, the hope was that that could maybe reach some folks who might not have transportation or, opportunities to get out to public meetings that were, at the nearby community center. We typically try to use just a wide variety of different channels, so things like, a printed and mailed newsletter. We don't necessarily rely as much for resident outreach on using online sources just because we don't know necessarily if people have connectivity. But it really is basically our outreach team looks at each project kind of individually and looks at, okay, what's the makeup of our area that we're working in and what are going to be the best ways to reach them. So, sometimes it's having a physical board at the community center. It's having just a wide variety of things where people can get information.
Thank you, Lisa. So, Mike, our final question for you is, anecdotally, were there any additional complications with using the cisterns, such as smell from captured organic material?
We had a checklist of things to look for each one. Smell was on there, color was on there, mosquitoes were on there, and we ran into no particular issues. Occasionally we had a layer of, to use the technical term, gunk at the bottom, and we aren't quite sure where that came from, but once it was flushed out, it took care of itself. But no color, smell kind of issues, no.
Thank you, Mike. Lisa, our final question for you is, do you recommend different BMPs for combined sewer areas versus separate sewer areas?
Yes, so we could probably have a whole webinar just on this topic. Basically, so Kansas City, we have 319 square mile city, and I believe it's about 50 square miles of it are our combined sewer area. So we have projects in our separate sewer area that are done through our stormwater group, and then our combined sewer green infrastructure is through our overflow control program. So we do approach the projects differently. So if it's in a combined sewer, we're really looking for volume capture. And, in our case with the consent decree, we have specific volume requirements that we're trying to pick up in many of these projects. So that gets us into looking at, they run modeling to look at, okay, how big does it need to be able to serve the, in our case, it's called a Storm D storm, which is about 1.4 inches in 24 hours. So in a combined sewer, that is of utmost importance. That's what we're really looking at, because most of these, if they do dewater through an under drain or other means, they're dewatering back into our combined system. So we're not really looking at trying to necessarily clean the water. We're looking at trying to basically infiltrate or slow down as much as we possibly can so we can peel it off of going into the sewer. In our separate sewer area, that's where we're looking at our water quality storm, which in Kansas City, I think it's around a 1.34 inch in 24 hours. And so those are designed to pick up pollutants. So it is a very different, goal. And so some of the techniques are different too. So yeah, that is always a, it's a fine level of detail that gets very challenging to convey when we're talking with residents and developers, because there's some nuance there and difference between the techniques. But yeah, primarily combined sewer, we're looking at volume, and then in the separate, we're looking at water quality. So quantity, I guess, and quality.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I think that about wraps it up. I'd like to thank Michael and Lisa today for joining us with your very interesting presentations and thoughtful responses to our audience questions. And thank you to all of our participants for listening in as well. As a reminder, today's presentation will be available on EPA's Green Infrastructure website, which is listed at the bottom of this slide, epa.gov/green-infrastructure. and it will be available within the next few weeks. Please join us for our next webcast planned for November of 2016. And stay tuned for our website for additional details about that webcast. That ends our webcast for today. Thank you for joining us. Bye.